everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this talk by Professor Amritjit Singh, which is in the MMIAS, Mumbai Münster Institute of Advanced Studies, lecture series for the year 2023. This is our second talk this year, am I right? This is our second lecture this year, and we are very fortunate to have had Professor Amritjit joining us for this talk. We are fortunate because he otherwise lives in the USA and we have never afforded to have him over from the USA. But he is here in India for several other engagements and we nabbed him. So here he is with us. A very brief introduction because his biodata runs into several pages. Amritjit Singh is the Langston Hughes Professor Emeritus of English and African American Studies at Ohio University and has served as a senior editor for the MELA series, Rutgers University Press. Currently, he is a visiting fellow at the South Asia Institute, University of Texas, Austin. He has earlier taught for 20 years at Rhode Island College, where he was named the Mary Tucker Thorpe Professor of Arts and Sciences, and also received the 2023 Alumni Association's Distinguished Faculty Award. Professor Singh has held visiting positions at several universities. Past president of Nellis, Sala, and USA ECLAS. Singh has was also the creative writing editor for the South Asian Review. He serves on the editorial boards of several academic and literary national and international journals. An internationally known literary critic and scholar, Professor Singh has lectured and taught widely at many international universities. He has been the recipient of many prestigious fellowships. His scholarly interests include African American studies and South Asian studies, as well as inter-ethnic migration, transnational and post-colonial studies. His work examines the issue of borders and border crossings in both North America and South Asia at the cusp of post-colonial theory and critical race theory. Professor Singh has authored, edited, or co-edited over 15 books. So we welcome you here, sir, and are looking forward very much to your talk. But before that, I request our Kirti to give you a small memento on behalf of MIAS. It's really small, not to worry. Actually, we had a more suitable chair for this session today, but she's caught in the traffic, the head of the law department, University of Mumbai. So she is on the way. She will be joining us soon. So
and now that you know that I do own a silk jacket, I will take it off. Just a little more. Yeah. Putting on this chair. So there are two Amritjit Singhs. So I'm a pleasure to meet all of you, and there are a few people online, and I understand this talk will be recorded, so you may have an opportunity to mention it to your friends later on. I'm always happy to have students in the audience, and I'm glad that you are all here. And I would like your questions because I'm always looking to learn from my students. Faculty members are welcome, but we have our way of dominating discussions, those of us who are teachers. So students, I want to thank Professor Nirufor Barucha for inviting me. We've been talking about this possibility for a couple of years at least. And you'll be able to nab me again because I do come to India frequently because of COVID for 5 years. I've not been here. I was here in 2018 and I'll be coming again pretty regularly. So I'm also grateful to Kirti Tejas and Jagruti Panchal. Kirti has navigated the whole thing so smoothly, it's unbelievable. She is always available to respond to questions, and she is very friendly and she is very competent. If you can combine friendliness and competence, that's a good thing. Right? And I am grateful to the professor. We are waiting for Dr. Rajeshri and Varadi. He's a professor of law, and as we move forward, you'll notice that my talk has legal and constitutional components. So I'm very happy that she will be able to join and give up. So I have a talk in several sections, and I'll try to keep them short because I want to leave time for our conversation. I don't want it to be a one-way street, whereas if I'm offering you something and you are receiving, it has to be. So first of all, I do think that this talk has relevance to diaspora studies. In fact, I was talking to Jasmeet Jain, dear friend at Jaipur, and she kind of offhandedly said, Amrit, diaspora is now going to be over soon. And what she means is that diaspora now becomes more quickly part of the community they go into, right? Because the globe is much closer. Technology has contributed a lot to that. And so my point in this talk is that even as diaspora becomes part of the new community that they enter, how Indians become American, right? I went to the United States in 1968 to do my PhD. It took me 5 years to do my PhD. 2 years out of that, I was teaching full time. Then I stayed 1 more year and I came to Hyderabad. Then I went to Jaipur. So it's very unusual because most people who do their PhDs, especially in the sciences, but even in the humanities, they don't come back. I was here for 9 years. 4.5 years in Hyderabad, 4.5 years in Jaipur. So my sense of these questions is very different, because I feel that I have been on this intercontinental journey all my life. And again, after returning to the United States in 1983, when my family preferred to stay on there, I did it reluctantly, but there's been a lot of compensation. Teaching is very fulfilling in the United States, I must tell you. There's no disrespect for my students here. They are very affectionate, and the ones who want to learn, they learn so well. But in a classroom in the United States, students come prepared, and they ask you questions, and they participate. That's how it works. It's not, as I said at the beginning, a one-way street. So definitely, I have a sense of diaspora studies as more of a ongoing migration and immigration situation. You know, that's. I'm not saying that my life alone should epitomize that experience. There are so many different experiences. There are so many different models there. So what I want to do is, because I have the handout and I have some PowerPoint pictures. So I want to leave the first part of my talk, which I'll read in 15 minutes or so, and go to section 2, which I'll summarize for you. I'm not going to read. What's the point of this talk? I want to tell you in very simple terms. I already got complimented by Professor Singh that I don't talk post-structuralist language. If you're looking for very big words that you cannot understand, you are in the wrong place. I don't do that. I'm going to be very accessible and disappoint you. that I don't use big words. I know what those big words mean. I've done a book called Post-Colonial Theory in the United States, where we navigated through all that stuff. And in a couple of weeks, I'll be giving a keynote on post-colonial studies, where I'll go through things like third space and strategic essentialism and all that, like Spiwak and Homi Bhabha and others. But I'm with Edward Said when he says that these people could have talked in much simpler language about these things. But to come back to this talk, most of us have this idea of the United States as a nation of immigrants. We also call it a nation of nations because different nationalities have come together. In the 19th century, beginning in the 19th century particularly, huge migrations took place from Europe. Of course, the Western Europe and to a lesser extent Northern Europe, they dominated to begin with. But then you get to Eastern Europe, you get to Polish people, you get to Russian Jews, all kinds of people. The Greeks came, Italians came, the Irish came. And so it's a legit thing to consider it as a nation of immigrants. But what I'm going to do today is to not deny any of that. I'm not rejecting any of that. But I'm saying that we need to also consider the possibility of another narrative of the United States. And I prefer using the word United States, not America. Of course, you can't say United States, right? So if I refer to people who live there, I'm compelled to use the word Americans. But America is much larger than the United States. It includes Canada, it includes the Caribbean, it includes Mexico. So it's a completely different thing. United States is ultimately a small part of it. So what I want to do today is to look at a narrative of United States which puts citizenship at the center of. Yes. So we put citizenship issues at the center. What do we mean by that? I think there's some other people who want to come. Yeah. So this is what, because if you look at just the narrative of migration, you get one picture. But if you include some non-immigrant groups and you think about the citizenship issues, then that has to do with legal and constitutional matters. I'm glad Professor Varanasi is here to guide us on that. For example, tell me if anyone, if you want to, feel free to participate. Who would be the non-immigrant Americans?
The natives.
Native Americans. Thank you. Any others? African Americans. Why? African Americans has not come as voluntary immigrants. They were forced to come there. They were brought in slave ships. If you have read a book like Toni Morrison's Beloved, she has a pretty searing picture in the middle of the book of those slave ships. And there are many other books. Charles Johnson's book, Middle Passage. There are many other books on that subject. So then there's the third group that you may not have thought about. We hear about Mexican Americans, but there's a group called Chicanos. These are not the same as Mexican Americans who have come in recent years. These are people who lived in what is United States before the United States stole huge pieces of land from Mexico. How many of you know that California and Arizona and Utah, all these states, 9 or 10 states used to be part of Mexico before 1848. Yes. So Chicanos are people of American background who were living in the United States before 1848. So these are not new immigrants. So if you take any of these three groups and put them in the mix, then the picture changes. Right? Then we realized that here are groups that who have been, because Irish came, Italian came, they suffered a lot. There used to be signs in Boston, Irish and dogs not allowed here. It's pretty horrible. There were similar signs for Finnish people. Around Fitchburg, Massachusetts, there are populations of Finnish Americans. There were similar things about Italians. They were called all kinds of slurs to their faces. But a couple of generations later, they empowered themselves by becoming white. The Irish in Ireland never think of themselves as white. The Italians in Italy never think of themselves as white. They think of themselves as Irish people. But when they come to America and they become part of the white American community, they become white. And this issue constantly comes up in my classroom. My students will say, Dr. Singh, you emphasize so much of suffering of blacks and so on. But our grandparents also suffered. Granted. But in a couple of generations, they assimilated, they became Americans, they became white Americans, and that's. But in the case of Native Americans, as one of you already noticed, in the case of African American, it looks like this never ends. Right? So, for example, African American, that's the part of the story that I will. In fact, I'm going. Yeah, look at the handout so that we can go through this very quickly. If you look at the two sections here, African American history and then second Asian American history. If the PowerPoint, no, give it a couple more minutes. I want to go over the handout. So there was a civil war, which was the bloodiest war that United States has ever fought. You may not know that. It was more destructive than all the wars the United States has fought since then. And you know, my adopted country is very fond of fighting wars. World War II, the Korean War, the Gulf War, Iraq, you name it. Well, World War II probably was a very necessary war because getting rid of fascism, you know, and it was very important. And so many countries were involved. It was a very destructive war. But what I'm trying to remind you is the Civil War was much more destructive than World War I or World War II or World War I and World War II together, plus with all these other wars. So, on 1st January 1863, President Lincoln declared the Emancipation Proclamation, and black people were given basic citizenship rights. Some of you have seen that movie, Lincoln. If you haven't, you should look at it again. Why was President Lincoln so concerned about making 14th Amendment permanent? Because if he had just issued an executive order, then the next president comes and they can just remove it. Obama had issued a lot of executive privileges. Mr. Trump came and removed them. Yes. Mr. Biden came and he removed the executive orders that were given by Trump. So 14th Amendment is part of the Constitution. So he gave them permanent rights. He gave them basic rights. But something happened that we don't often discuss. 1876, there was an election which was disputed. In recent years, you have heard about the election in 2000 that was disputed between Junior Bush and Al Gore. And that was resolved by the Supreme Court in favor of George Bush. And Al Gore was very gracious. He was the vice president. He could have created a huge mess like Mr. Trump was trying to do after his defeat in 2020. But Mr. Gore chose not to do that. Right? So what happened in 1876? The Republican presidential candidate was Rutherford Hayes. He was from Ohio, the state where I lived for almost 14 years. And now remember, who are the friends of the Negro in 19th century? Republicans or Democrats? Who are the friends of the black people today? Democrats. In the 19th century, Republican. Lincoln was a Republican. But everything has changed. You know, all the Democrats and from the American South, they have become Republicans. They were very conservative. They were slaveholders. They did not want to give too many rights to black people. So Rutherford Hayes was a good man. He was a friend of the Negro. I'm using the word that was used in the 1990s all the way to the 1960s. That was an acceptable word. Langston Hughes' poem, his most famous poem, his first published poem is called The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Right? So he's writing that poem in the early 20th century. So the House, the Southern Democrats, they said, okay, Mr. Hayes, we'll give you the presidency, we'll let you sit in the White House. There's one condition. Please withdraw the federal troops from the South. As soon as he withdrew the federal troops from the South, Reconstruction came to an end. Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877 is like the first affirmative action. But how can you resolve the issues of 3 million black people in 12 years? How can you reconstruct the South where most of white women had lost their husbands to the war? It's not just only about black people. It's also about reconstructing the whole South after the Civil War. So that's those the dates I've given. Then you get to 1896, and there was a new law passed, Plessy versus Ferguson, which even the most conservative judges, even judges like Alito and Clarence Thomas, they declared that was the wrong one. That was segregation, permanent segregation. Blacks and whites cannot travel together in the train and in the bus. You remember Rosa Parks, 1955, when she refused to give the seat to a white man. And that was not accidental. It's not that one day Rosa Parks was tired. This was all planned. And Dr. Martin Luther King was already involved in it. He was not yet the famous leader he became. But that starts in 1896. Apartheid was happening not just in South Africa, it was also happening in the United States of America, beginning 1896. All this had to be addressed again by Lyndon Johnson, who was from Austin, Texas, where I live now. And he passed the 1963 Civil Rights Act. Then in 1965, he passed the Voting Rights Act. He also passed the Immigration Act, because of which people like me can become American citizens. Because that's the other story. So let's go to now Asian American story, which is also full of not only social custom, but also court decision, Supreme Court decision. So when do you think Asians started appearing in the United States? Most of you think it's all a recent phenomenon. No, it's not a very recent phenomenon. In the 1850s, there were 100,000 Chinese and who were building the railroads along with the Irish. When we write American history, we talk about the Irish, but we very rarely acknowledge that Chinese also were part of that. If the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 had not been passed, those 100,000 Chinese today, can you imagine? And more Chinese coming, not stopping them. Chinese people alone, forget about Indians, forget about Japanese, forget about Koreans, forget about Filipinos. Chinese alone would be probably 6, 7, 8% of the American population. Today, all Asian Americans, including Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Filipinos, Indians, Pakistanis, Sri Lankans, Bangladeshi, are about 5%. So when you do these things, no matter what part of the world you're doing, right? I'm not going to talk about the part of the world you live in, but when you do those things, you are making long-term damages to the possibilities of democracy, to participatory democracy. And those things cannot be rectified very easily, right? So go on to then, I want to move on. I particularly want to go to 1924 at the Asian American history. They passed the National Origin Act. Why did they call the National Origin Act? Because they said it's easier to assimilate people of background who are already here. That's often a way of excluding others, right? Germans are already there. Bring more Germans. The Irish are already there. Bring more Irish. But that means even people from Eastern Europe cannot come because there were very few of them. They were there, but Greeks were very few. The Poles were very few. The Germans, the Jews were very few. So they were excluded. But then at the same time, they passed as part of that law, Asian Exclusion Act. They said no more people from Asia will be allowed to come. Before that, there were two things that happened that are mentioned right above that, 1923 and 1923. I do want to tell you, and I think Professor Barodi would be particularly interested. There was a Japanese guy named Ozawa. He lived in Hawaii, and he went up to the Supreme Court saying, I'm a very good man, I'm a very Christian man, I don't even allow my children to speak Japanese, they speak only English, we go to the white Christian church. All this, drum roll of how good an American he was. And the Supreme Court said, well, Mr. Ozawa, all this is good, but you are not white, so you are not eligible for citizenship, and you are not black, because after the 14th Amendment, black people were allowed to become citizens. So you don't fit into the two broad categories, your petition is denied. Next year, an Indian named Bhagat Singh went for the same case, and Ozawa lived in Hawaii, and Mr. Thin lived in California, but they were in touch with each other. We didn't have email, and we didn't have WhatsApp, and we didn't have Google and all that, but people wrote letters to each other. And Mr. Ozawa said to Mr. Thin, you are definitely going to get citizenship. Why? Because the Indians at that time were treated as Caucasians. I've never been thrilled about being treated as Caucasian at any point in my life. But when he went to the Supreme Court, listen to this. The Supreme Court said, Mr. Thin, we cannot deny that you are Caucasian. But how are we going to tell the white person from France, that you are white in the same way that he is? So they started creating new language, even on race, which went beyond the knowledge of the anthropologists. Supreme Court is now getting into the field of scholarship. The current Supreme Court in the United States is doing the same thing too. But so his petition was also denied. These are very important cases of citizenship history, naturalization history in the United States. And but him, as you know, is 6'10" to be persistent. In 1937, he got his citizenship. It took a while. It took 13 more years. But again, it was not a general rule. It was made as an exception. And then I have already talked about those Immigration Act, and so I won't spend more time. Let's show the PowerPoint. Yeah. There on the left side. Yeah. Next one. Yeah. Stop here. So these are Angel Island immigration stations. Just as the white people from Europe came through Ellis Island in New York, Asians, even Indian people, they came mostly to San Francisco. And Angel Island is, I think it's under reconstruction, but it still exists. And look at how people are being treated, they could be Chinese, mostly I think they are Chinese, and they are treated like criminals. Their bodies are such that there are children there, there are women there. There's put through very humiliating experiences. Next one. Very similar. Continuation of the same thing, examinations. Next one. more of that. Whether you are Japanese, whether you are Chinese, whether you are Indian, Koreans were not coming at that time. Philippines were not involved. You know why? Well, Philippines became an US colony, but that was a little later. They were not excluded, even by the 1924 National Religion Act. Look at that. There are, on the right side, there Chinese people are working on plantations in the south. They were there in Louisiana, they were there in Mississippi. Generally, we don't associate Chinese people with these places. We associate Chinese people with cities. Most Indians also live in the suburbs of major cities. And railroad laborers in the middle of the snow, they are working next to the Irish workers. But history doesn't mention them. Moving on. Now, this is now the other side. Jacob Lawrence was a famous Black American artist. He lived for a while in Nigeria when things were very bad in the 60s with Black Americans before the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1963. But he lived most of his life in Seattle and he did 51 plays. What do you get from this? You see the names? It says Chicago, New York, and St. Louis, and these people are moving into the train station. It could be one of our train stations in Mumbai or in Delhi. What are they doing? One of the students. What is this painting about? People are rushing from the south to go to northern cities. So what I want you to do, this is my main point. Imagine that the great migration of blacks from the south is very similar to Russian Jews coming from Russia because they were being persecuted there by the Tsar to America. So if you imagine the migration of blacks, and this is very much part of diaspora study, if you imagine the huge numbers that move from the south to just get some breathing space, to give their children some opportunities, to have jobs, even bad jobs, instead of no jobs, and persecution by the police, persecution by the landlords, persecution for previous slave holders. So this is a image. Next one. What do you think of this? This is part of the same series. What does this suggest? Anyone? News is a huge part of African American experience. Why? Because you have heard of lynching.
Yeah.
They'll catch if some young black man, mostly young black men, just as young black men continue to be hit by police people even today, right? If a white man is doing something a little off, they get arrested alive. And then they get an opportunity to get a trial. If a young black man is found doing something, is that very few of the young black men involved in any encounter with the police survive that encounter. So why didn't they show the actual lynching? Why show this? I want you to also see how you read art. Not that I'm a very good art critic or art reader. If you show now the man is sitting there depressed, lynching is bad, but have to constantly consider the possibility that you are going to get lynched. It's much worse. The live in fear. Richard Wright has a point between the world and me. The first stanza talks about an actual lynching. The second stanza talks about the speaker in the poem, the persona in the poem, imagining how he might be lynched. When you live in fear, when you cause fear for citizens of any country, any background, in any part of the world, then that's what you are doing. You want them to be scared. You want them to accept second-class citizenship, third-class citizenship. That's what happens to blacks, especially young blacks, young male blacks. Women also suffer, older blacks can also suffer. But the main target to this day remains young blacks. Next one. You see that? There were lightening laws in the South. I went to Savannah, Georgia, for that US ACLS conference. I was the one who founded that organization. And it's pretty much disappeared, by the way, unfortunately. The black guy who was driving me from the airport to the hotel, and hotel was run by Gujaratis, a huge motor. And he said, sir, find out, Mr. Singh, find out what your room is, I'll drive you to a room. I said, but I'm in the hotel, I can walk. No, I don't want you to walk. This is around 2000, right? This is only 20 years ago, 22 years ago. Here the black man concerned about my safety because it is 10 in the night. And he thinks even if I walk from one part of the huge hotel, I won't be safe. Then there was a black woman who was a professor of religion, but she was also part of the church there. She said the same thing. She saw us walking from the campus to our hotel. Then she said, no, please come into my car, I'll drop you. Because even in the 21st century, young black men would be arrested if they are seen. Just any excuse to arrest them. You don't want to do that to citizens of any background, but they done that. That's the reason they would want to migrate to the north. Moving on. Now this is a cartoon. Left side is of course a black man. Right side is an Irish man who is made to look even in the image of black features, African features. Because for a while, the Irish were treated worse than blacks. Because the Irish were considered lazy. Even blacks were considered more hardworking than the Irish. Moving on. Now these are my granduncles. Right? 1905, my father was born in 1911. So it's actually before my father was born. So they are like younger brothers of my grandfather, right? And these are people who were doing strawberry farms and lumber in Vancouver, in California, in Oregon, all the West Coast, state of Washington. 1907 in Bellingham, Indians, most of them Sikhs, most of them turban Sikhs, they almost got lynched. And the city of Bellingham in 2007 was very reluctant to even declare a commemoration or any kind of apology. I think finally the mayor did it, but very reluctantly. So these people were similar, there were similar Chinese workers, there were similar Japanese workers, but they had no way to communicate with each other. They can't form coalitions. All right, moving on. This is a cartoon quickly because they show a Sikh with a we Sikhs do a lot of bad things, but we mostly don't smoke. But the American, the Uncle Sam doesn't want him, and the British rulers in India don't want him. He's caught between those two. Moving on. This is Komagata Maru. Dr. Barucha can tell you much more. The older white guy with the white turban and the white beard, and with his son is Gurdeep Singh. He was the leader. In 1940, he took 366 people, mostly Sikhs, but there were Muslims, there were Sikh, Hindus, there were mostly Punjabis. They went and they were not allowed to disembark at Vancouver Airport. There's a movie that you can watch. Please note it down. Continuous Journey. Continuous Journey. You can just Google it and you can watch. It's done by an Indian, Ali Kazini, who is a professor at York University, and it tells you it's a very important thing for you to learn if you want to understand the history. I believe that history is very important. If you don't learn history, then we have much higher chances of making the same mistakes again. So Is this the last one, or maybe there's one more? That's it. So you get now a sense of my argument. My argument is that it's not enough to talk about United States only as a nation of immigrants. You also have to put citizenship issues. So I'm going to read you a few pages. How are we doing on time? Yeah. Let me just read it with this. I will prepare talk and 30 pages. So you'll be here for a long time, but I'm not going to give you it. I promise. I want to begin by invoking the words of our most fascinating and conflicting figure, Thomas Jefferson. In his notes on the state of Virginia, 1781 to 1784, amidst his more controversial views on blacks and American Indians, Jefferson offers a strong moral condemnation of slavery in words that ring with power and clarity even today. And I'm quoting Jefferson. This is 1780s, 18th century. I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever, that considering numbers, nature, and natural means only, a revolution on the wheel of fortune. He subscribed to the wheel of fortune. The idea is that today you can be at the top of the world, top of the fortune wheel. Tomorrow you can come to the bottom. So his fear is that at some point blacks will control. And once blacks control the power, he is fearful of what they might do to blacks, to whites. Based on what whites have done to blacks, it could be pretty hard. An exchange of situations is among possible events. I'm still quoting Jefferson. That it may become probable by supernatural interference. The Almighty has no attribute which can take side with us in such a contest. He recognizes that what white people have done to blacks in slavery is morally wrong. He acknowledges that. The overall impression that Jefferson conveys in notes and his actions or non-actions throughout his long life is his deep and unresolved ambivalence on slavery and related issues. An ambivalence that is symptomatic of the nation's trajectory on racial formation since its beginning. And by the way, the term racial formation is from critical race theory, which is under heavy attack by people like DeSantis and Trump and Fox News and everything. I use the term racial formation in the way Michael Comey and Howard Venant use it in a well-known text. It's called Racial Formation in the United States, a very good book. I'm basically talking of whiteness studies, critical race theory. But as literary historian Dana Nelson observed, Jefferson's ambivalence, and I'm quoting, is finally less relevant to an analysis of his ethnic stance than the way his text creates a space for white subjectivity and a perspective on his black object. What does he mean? This Dana Wilson is the woman. What does Dana Wilson mean? That even when he talks about the wheel of fortune, what is he concerned with? He's not concerned with what is being done to blacks. He's concerned more with his fears for the harm that could come to white people. Right? So that's the point. Less concerned about a slave despite the high prophetic notes of 2018, Jefferson worried about the moral and physical threat to white liberty produced by the slave system. Right. So Jefferson's statement made more than 250 years before Martin Luther King's more inclusive discourses on beloved community, because I'm going to close with that. Allow me to seg into the project I've chosen to share with you this afternoon. As a teacher, scholar, as well as a citizen with an active transnational biography, which I described at the beginning, I'm passionately interested in exploring the United States Argos journey on race. Speaking in a Faulknerian way, William Faulkner, events and individuals of the past represent a quarry from which we keep extracting rocks and marbles to build a house called the future, which we hope would have many doors and windows. You don't want to snuff anyone out, whether it's women, whether it's blacks, whether it's Dalit. You don't want to put them in a position where they are just trying to get some fresh air. You know, Langston used that beautiful point what happens to a dream differ. If you don't remember the title, you can't say that the poem is about blacks. Does it dry like a raisin in the sun? Does it fester like a wound? And then the last line, or does it explode? If you suppress people too long, you are going to have anger, rebellion on your hands. Doesn't matter what part of the world that is happening. I value the role literature can play not only in recording history, but also in shaping culture and consciousness. By imagining the past and maybe outlining the future through emotion and language, through image and narrative. Writers, black and white, men and women, have created specific characters and situations and used their storytelling powers to confront, challenge, and subvert dominant narratives, national myths, and racial biases. That's what I'm concerned with. So then you put in the middle now what I already described for you. On one hand, you have the history of Black Americans, and on the other hand, you see of the Asian Americans. Why did I put the two together? You have to ask, right? They don't seem like a parallel history, right? But what I'm saying is that roughly in the same time period, because I mentioned to you 1877, Chinese Exclusion Act also mentioned here in 1882. Then it was renewed in 1892. In 1902, it was made permanent. So essentially, things are happening to African Americans and Asian Americans in essentially the same time period. What is happening? While blacks are being deprived of what they gained through the Civil War, Asian Americans are being kept from becoming part of the US community. यहाँ मत आओ, दरवाजा बंद है. उनको कहते हैं हाँ तुम यहाँ हो, but we are not ready to give you equal rights. In fact, there is a poem that the Harlem Renaissance poet wrote in 1919, which is Claude McKay was a Jamaican. I think I should be able to find it. Yeah, I found it. I think it sums up what I'm saying very quickly, so I'll just read it. It's a sonnet. Here's a man who is writing sonnet about a very emotional racial situation. Come on, there's another page in between. It's called If We Must Die. So here's what happened. Often people who are minorities, right? We have minorities here, we have minorities in the United States. They're always under pressure to prove their patriotism. So in the early 20th century, around 1914, when World War I started, blacks are trying to decide whether they should participate in World War I or not. They decide to participate, led by Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was amazing. You should check out his book called Souls of Black Folk. I think it's mentioned somewhere. It's a beautiful book, especially its opening chapter, where he says we are forced to look upon ourselves through the eyes of others. So they went. When they came back in 1990, when the war, 1919, like white people, they took out victory parades. But in 26 cities, whites attacked them. And they are not saying, thank you, brother. Thank you, my Black American brother. You also participated on behalf of the Allies in World War I. And Allies in World War II become even more important. But by that time, blacks did gain. They talked about the double V, victory at home and victory abroad. They said if we are going to fight against fascism in Europe, in Germany, we should also fight against fascism at home. Those decisions have to be made by you, whether you fight against fascism or not. So, but this guy wrote a poem because there were riots in 26 cities. If we must die, let it not be like horse, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot. While round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mark at our cursed lawn. If we must die, well, let's nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain, that even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. For kinsmen, We must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men will face the murderous cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. It's basically an expansion of the message from that poem called Harlem Financial Views. How do things explode? People fight back. They don't sit back and they become just completely passive recipients of victimhood that is being thrust upon them. So I want to just mention a couple of things and I'm going to close. One is the citizenship definition. What do I mean by that? So I just looked at the dictionary. This is the dictionary definition, Webster's dictionary. A citizen is a member, I'm quoting, a member of a state and nation, especially one with a republican government, not republican with capital R. Republican meaning as part of a republic. We are a republic in India. Yes, we became a republic on 26th of January 1950. Who owes its allegiance and is entitled to full civil rights by birth and naturalization. And citizenship involves the duties, rights, and privileges of this status. Then I go quote from Richard Bellamy, who has this little book on citizenship, and I think that is helpful to read. Citizenship is a condition of civic equality. It consists of membership of a political community where all citizens can determine the terms of social cooperation on an equal basis. This status not only secures equal rights to the enjoyment of the collective goods provided by the political association, but also involves equal duties to promote and sustain them, including the good of democratic citizenship itself. So that's the citizenship I'm talking about. So it's not enough to talk about immigration as a great thing that America did. If you have people who are not immigrant and they do not have basic rights generation after generation, that is an issue we should be concerned with as citizens in a democratic structure in a republic. So I want to just give you one or two literature examples and then conclude, because otherwise you may get thrown out of the literature club, you know. It gets reported that I didn't talk about literature at all. And I gave a 40-minute speech. So just I think maybe they are not mentioned in this handout. I would like to give you examples from a writer named Rudolf Fischer, note down, F-I-S-H-E-R, Rudolf with a P-H at the end, Rudolf Fischer. And he died young. He was a medical doctor, even though he was a black man. He did an undergraduate at Brown University, which is one of the Ivy League schools, and he did his MD at Harvard University, the black school in Washington, D.C. And he had a practice, but he was a radiologist and actually got exposed to a lot of, what do you call it, radiation. And he died young. But he's a beautiful short story writer. So he has a short story. He has two short stories with grandmother, because often that's unfortunately still continuing in African American community. Often grandmothers will bring up children because the parents die or they are involved in bad activity and whatever. So, so the one short story is that the grandson moves to New York, and the grandmother is a very Bible-based, Bible-felt, and very church-going person. And she used to tell her grandson, well, you know, you should become a doctor. You should become an attorney. If not anything, you should become the owner of a funeral home. So she's, you know, जैसे हमारे हिंदुस्तानी लोग करते हैं, बच्चों को डॉक्टर बनाना है, इंजीनियर बनाना है, आर्किटेक्ट बनाना है, तो उसके इमेजिनेशन के मुताबिक वो भी वही. She also has these ambitions for her grandson. Grandson comes to New York and he is involved in the performance. He's the performer. does dance, he sings, he has a girlfriend. So they now don't know how to deal with the old woman is coming from the south to Harlem. Harlem is very different. This is Harlem of the 20s, Harlem of the Harlem Renaissance. That's why I mentioned that in the abstract. We are stopping in 1920. We start in 1850 with the 100,000 Chinese workers, and we are stopping with the Harlem Renaissance. So she comes and the grandson receives her at the bus stand, and so the grandson doesn't tell her what he does. She's kept in the dark, and then he invites her to Apollo Theater, which still exists. I mean, Harlem is not a frightening place. The Indians who live in the United States, they stay away from black people. They don't want to visit Harlem as if it's some kind of a dangerous place. I've been going to Harlem since 1970, almost every year. I did my research at the Schomburg Library. So anyway, so the grandson is very clever. Although this is a Bible-loving grandmother, she used to hum a love song when he was a young boy. So what he has done is that he has done a performance of that love song that she used to hum and performed it on the stage. And the old woman is sitting in the audience and she said, "Oh, that's not too bad." So she accepts what the grandson and his girlfriend do. It's not an evil thing to be an actor, to be a movie star, to be a singer. You know, even for Indians, we need to know if your child wants to be a painter, an artist, support them. If they want to play the guitar, or they want to play the sitar, give them a chance. So, and this story also tells you how culture changes with migration. When people go from here and they live in America, Canada, New Zealand, as where Janet is, they don't remain the Indians that they were here. After 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, when their children come. The other story, unfortunately, is not such a happy story. The two grandsons, and again the grandmother has brought them up, and it's called Promised Land. So they fight over, they fall in love with the same girl, and they are fighting on the balcony, and the situation is that they both of them kill each other. Of course, the Richard Wright's story, Black Boy. So I just want to conclude with, I promised, there's of course the Chinese American writers like Sui Sin Fa, I have a whole comparison of Sui Sin Fa and Rudolf Fischer, but I'm not going to read it. I want to get to the conclusion, which is I hinted with Dr. Martin Luther King, who talked about the beloved community, where no one's dignity, no one's rights are abrogated; they're all respected. But I want to draw a couple of conclusions. One is that this whole talk is about encouraging you to do comparative studies, reading across cultures and ethnicities, interethnically, transnationally, with languages and culture. And India is a rich ground. I mean, people should be studying a Marathi text next to a Bengali text. They should be reading Hindi, Punjabi, everything. Now those options are available to you in MA and MPhil. They were not always available. And recognizing that the identities of individuals, groups, and nations are always in process. Don't think that there was some heroic great golden age. There was no golden age in America, and there was no golden age in this country. This is an illusion, right? Because things are always changing. It's not as if there was some fixed identity of India and we are running away from it. India is always in flux. As Stuart Hall reminds us, identity is contextual. Where US, even though I do know how critical I am of the United States, but I also give them credit that when they face a problem, they work on it. They do it as rational. Sometimes, of course, if you have irrational forces surrounding you, you cannot find rational solutions. But ultimately, intersubjectivity, that's a term Charles Johnson, black novelist, which is that if I want something for myself, I should also want it for you. If I cannot respect your needs, if I cannot show empathy for your needs, then something is missing in me as a human being. So Martin Luther King wants to move past binaries to create subjectivities that are affirmatively include the victims of the disenfranchisement by systems and institutions. Our concern should be with building communities where we respect difference, have no tolerance for bigotry of any kind, based on race, based on class, based on caste, based on religion. That's where I'm going. And all this, by the way, comes from critical race theory. In addition to post-colonial theory, essays like Peggy McIntosh, we should note it down. Peggy McIntosh on white privilege. Just Google it, you'll find it. I mentioned the racial formation by Michael Omi and Howard Winner. This is where I want to end. Thank you for listening, and I'm very much looking forward to comments by the chair, but also by questions by all of you, especially students. At the end, I will read another poem for you, and I'll also read it in Hindi, but we'll wait for that. And then I also have this book about the early immigrants who are mostly Sikhs. This is done by University of California, Berkeley. And it has beautiful pictures of the, this one you saw that, I took it from there, but there are many more. The kind of pictures I showed you about Angel Island, the pictures with Sikhs also. Sikhs were treated the same way the Chinese and Japanese were treated. So it's a beautiful book. So you can take it out there. Thank you.